The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $65, and Delbert Hoy laughed loud enough to turn heads 3 rows back. It was the kind of laugh a man practices in front of a mirror, wide and public, meant to make sure nobody missed who was doing the laughing or who was being laughed at. And the man being laughed at did not look up. He only lifted one finger to the brim of his work cap in acknowledgment, walked to the clerk's table, counted out 3 20s and a 5 in bills so soft they felt like cloth, and signed his name in the small, careful hand of a man who had signed for other men's property most of his life. The object on the flatbed behind the clerk's table was an ammunition crate, though calling it that was generous. It had been an ammunition crate once, back when the stencils on its side still read something the eye could follow. Now the stencils were half burned away, and the crate itself had been welded shut along every seam, top and bottom and all 4 sides, in a heavy running bead that looked, from a distance, like a scar drawn around the whole box. The steel of the lid had been reinforced with a second plate, and that plate had been welded down too. Somebody had wanted this crate closed. Somebody had wanted it closed forever. The date was the 14th of March, 1979, and the place was the old Renfro farm out past the second bridge on the county road, about 9 miles south of Ashcombe, Tennessee. The Renfro estate had been in probate for 11 years. While 3 cousins argued over pasture they never intended to work, and when the last cousin died, the county sold the whole lot at auction to settle the taxes. The barn had been full of things: a hay rake with 1 wheel, a stack of milking pails soldered by a boy in 1943, a trunk of mildewed magazines, and in the corner, under a canvas tarp gone green with mold, the welded crate. Ezra Bellamy was 68 years old on the day he bought it. He stood 5 feet 10 in his work boots, though a lifetime bent over a torch had put a slow curve in his upper back that made him look shorter than he was. His face was long and lined the way a river cut is lined, and his eyes were the color of wet slate, and he wore a chambray shirt buttoned to the second button and a canvas jacket the color of old wheat, and a work cap that had once said something on the front, but did not say it any more. His hands were the hands of a man who had made his living with fire and steel for 52 years. The knuckles were thick, the fingernails were short and clean, though the skin around them was gray with a gray that would not come off. On the back of his right hand was a burned scar the shape of Tennessee itself, which he told the young men at the shop was a joke God had made and left for him to find. Delbert Hoy was 49, and Delbert Hoy sold Chevrolets. He stood by the auction ring in a mustard yellow sport coat with a dealership pin on the lapel, and his neck spilled over the collar of a white shirt, and there was a ring on his little finger with a green stone that caught the March sun whenever he lifted his hand to point at something. His car, a 2-year-old Impala, the color of a swimming pool, was parked at an angle to the barn as though it had been placed there for a photograph. He had come to the auction because he liked to buy things cheap and tell people what he had paid. And he stayed because Ezra Bellamy had made the only bid on the welded crate, and that single bid at $65 was to Delbert Hoy, the funniest thing he had seen in a month of Sunday. He walked up to the flatbed, with 2 of his salesmen trailing behind him, and he slapped the side of the crate with the flat of his hand, and he said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear, "Bellamy, you just bought yourself the world's most expensive doorstop." One of the salesmen laughed. The small laugh salesman learned to laugh. Delbert Hoy was not finished. He pointed at the crate and said, "Look at that thing. That is not a box. That is a tomb. What are you going to do with it, Ezra? Bury your savings in it? Because if it is your savings, you are going to need a bigger box." And he laughed his own laugh again, and this time some of the crowd laughed with him, because Delbert Hoy was the sort of man whose laughter was safer to join than to ignore. From that afternoon on, in the coffee shops and the feed store and the barber shop in Ashcombe, the welded crate was known as Bellamy's tin coffin, and the price of $65 was told and retold as though it were the punchline of a joke everybody had helped to write. Ezra Bellamy did not answer Delbert Hoy. He walked around to the near side of the flatbed and put his palm flat against the welded seam along the top of the crate, and he stood there for a long moment, the way a man stands who is listening to something the rest of the room cannot hear. The weld under his hand was old. He could tell that from the color of the scale and the way the bead had rounded off with the years. But it was not clumsy. Whoever had welded this crate shut had known what he was doing. The bead was even. The stops were clean. Somebody who cared about the work had done this work. And somebody who cared about the work did not weld a crate shut for no reason. Ezra Bellamy had seen a lot of welded boxes in 52 years, and most of them had been welded shut by fools, trying to hide something small. But this one had been welded shut by a man who knew steel, and that was a different thing entirely. He had learned to read welds from a man named Harlan Pryor, who ran a shop in Chattanooga during the last years of the war, and took Ezra on as an apprentice in the spring of 1946, when Ezra was 15 and thin as a fence rail. Harlan Pryor had one glass eye and a limp from a scaffold fall in 1938, and he taught Ezra that a weld was a man's handwriting in steel, that a bead could be read the way a letter could be read, and that a careful bead was the mark of a careful mind. Harlan Pryor said more than once that a man could tell everything he needed to know about another man by looking at 3 welds he had made under no supervision. Ezra had believed him then. And when Ezra put his hand on the welded seam of that crate on the 14th of March, 1979, he was reading the handwriting of a man he had never met, and what he read told him that the man had been careful and had been sober and had meant for the crate to stay closed until somebody worth the trouble bothered to open it. He and his nephew Corbin, who was 19 that spring and quiet the way Ezra had been quiet at 19, loaded the crate onto the bed of Ezra's 1962 Ford pickup with a set of oak planks and a hand winch. The crate weighed more than a crate that size had any business weighing, Corbin noticed. Corbin did not say anything, but he looked at his uncle, and his uncle nodded once, which was the closest thing to a conversation the two of them needed. Delbert Hoy watched them load it, standing beside his blue Impala, with his thumbs in his belt loops, and as Ezra climbed into the cab and turned the key, Delbert Hoy called out, "Let me know when you get it open, Bellamy." "I'll bring the champagne." And he laughed once more, and the salesman laughed with him, and the old Ford rolled slow down the rutted lane toward the county road, with the crate riding low behind the rear axle. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it does not. Ezra Bellamy had lived his whole life inside that kind of patience. He had buried a wife in 1971 and a brother in 1974, and a good dog in 1977, and he had welded the gate of the cemetery himself 3 times, when the county would not pay to have it done. He was not a man who hurried. He was not a man who explained. He drove the crate home at the speed a man drives when he is carrying something he suspects is more than what it looks like, which is to say slowly and with both hands on the wheel. He did not open it that night. He backed the truck into the wide bay of his shop, which stood behind his house on a 2-acre lot at the edge of Ashcombe, and he left the crate on the flatbed under the hanging bulb and went inside and ate a supper of cornbread and beans, and he sat on the porch until the stars came out. Corbin came by around 8 and stood at the edge of the porch light and said, "You going to cut it tonight?" And Ezra said, "No." And Corbin said, "When?" And Ezra said, and Corbin nodded and went home, because Corbin had learned from his uncle that some questions did not need to be asked twice. For 3 days, Ezra Bellamy did nothing but look at the crate. He walked around it in the mornings with a cup of coffee in his hand. He ran his fingertips along the beads. He measured the plate on the top with a set of calipers and wrote the number in a small notebook. He tapped the sides with the butt of a screwdriver and listened for the sound of what was inside, and what he heard was not the flat thud of empty space, but a soft, close, muffled sound. He noted this in the notebook, too. On the second day, he took a magnet and ran it along every surface, and the magnet clung firmly to the sides and the bottom, but on the top plate near the front it clung more weakly, which told him that the plate there was thicker or that something behind it was interfering with the pull. He wrote this down and underlined it twice. Meanwhile, in Ashcombe, the story of the tin coffin had begun its slow circuit of the town. At the Blue Star Diner on Main Street, where the coffee was 30 cents and the pie was homemade, Delbert Hoy told the story to anyone who sat within 4 stools of him, and by Thursday of that week, there was not a soul in Ashcombe who had not heard some version of it. Old Wyatt Kimball, who had known Ezra since the two of them were boys throwing rocks at bottles behind the depot, walked out to the shop on Friday afternoon and stood at the open bay door with his hands in his overall pockets and said, "Ezra, the old town says you paid $65 for a box of nothing." And Ezra, who was cleaning a bench with a rag, said, without looking up, "The whole town has been wrong before." Wyatt Kimball grunted. He stood there another minute. Then he said, "Is it going to open?" And Ezra said, and that was the whole of the conversation, and Wyatt Kimball walked back to his own truck and drove away, and by the time he reached the diner, he was telling the coffee crowd that Ezra Bellamy had gone a little strange in his old age. The crate had not always been welded shut. Long before it came to rest under a moldy tarp in the Renfro barn, it had belonged to a man named Silas Renfro, who was the eldest brother of the 3 cousins who had spent 11 years arguing about pasture. Silas Renfro had been born in 1908 and had gone to France in 1944 as a supply sergeant with the 90th Infantry, and he had come home in the fall of 1945 with a limp and a folded flag and a footlocker full of paper. He had married a girl named Odessa Pyle in 1946 and had bought the farm from his father in 1949. And by 1955 he was known throughout the county as an honest man who paid his debts on the first of the month and never raised his voice at another man's dog. In the autumn of 1961, Silas Renfro was accused of stealing $11,000 from the Ashcombe Farmers Cooperative, which he had helped to found and on whose board he had served as treasurer for 6 years. The money had gone missing from a lockbox to which 4 men had keys. 3 of those men had alibis. Silas Renfro did not, because Silas Renfro had been at home alone on the night the money vanished, tending his wife Odessa, who was dying of a cancer that would take her the following March. The board voted 5-2 to expel him. The sheriff declined to press charges for lack of evidence, but the town pressed charges of its own kind, which are worse. And by the spring of 1962, Silas Renfro did not go into Ashcombe anymore. And by the fall of 1962, he did not go anywhere at all. Because in October of that year, his old Chevrolet went off the second bridge on the county road in a hard rain, and Silas Renfro drowned in 6 feet of muddy water with his hand still on the wheel. The farm passed to his 3 cousins, who did not speak to one another, and the barn was locked, and the house was closed, and the welded crate, which the cousins assumed to be a leftover piece of army junk, sat under its tarp for 17 years. None of them had ever thought to ask why a man would weld an ammunition crate shut. None of them had ever thought to ask much of anything about Silas Renfro at all. On the 4th night after the auction, Ezra Bellamy went into his shop and closed the bay door behind him and turned on the overhead lights and put on his leather apron and his welding goggles, and he stood in front of the crate for a long time without moving. Then he took up a small angle grinder and began very carefully to cut. He did not cut the welds. He cut alongside them a hair's width from the bead, letting the wheel eat the parent metal instead of the weld itself, because a weld tells a story, and Ezra Bellamy did not want to erase the story before he had finished reading it. He worked for 4 hours that first night, and he stopped every 20 minutes to let the steel cool and to sweep the shavings into a coffee can, and when he finally turned off the light and went in to bed at 2 in the morning, he had cut through no more than 8 inches of a single seam. He worked the next night, and the night after that. Corbin came by on the 3rd night and stood in the doorway and watched. And when Ezra took his break, Corbin asked, "Why don't you just torch the whole lid off?" And Ezra said, "Because whoever welded this shut did it for a reason, and a reason deserves respect." And Corbin thought about that for a long time and did not answer, and stayed until his uncle went back to work. On the 7th night, at 11:15, Ezra Bellamy finished the last inch of the last seam, and the top plate of the crate settled just slightly, no more than the width of a fingernail. And there was a small, dry sound in the shop, a sound like a held breath finally letting go. And Ezra Bellamy set down the grinder and took off his goggles and stepped back from the bench and did not touch the crate for a full 10 minutes. He sat on the wooden stool by the far wall and looked at the crate the way a man looks at a coffin at a wake, with the understanding that whatever was inside had been placed there by hands that had meant it. Then he stood up and walked to the crate and lifted the top plate with both hands, and he laid it down beside the crate as gently as if it had been made of glass. Inside the crate, wrapped in a layer of oiled canvas that smelled of gun grease and cedar, were 3 things. There was a leather ledger, cracked along the spine, in which were recorded, in a hand Ezra Bellamy did not yet know but would come to know, every deposit and withdrawal of the Ashcombe Farmers Cooperative from January of 1959 to September of 1961, in duplicate, and each entry initialed by 2 men, one of whom was Silas Renfro, and the other of whom was a name that made Ezra Bellamy sit down again on the stool. There was, beneath the ledger, a canvas sack of the sort a bank uses, and inside the sack were $11,320 in old bills, mostly 20s and 50s, banded with paper wrappers on which somebody had written a date in September of 1961. And there was, folded on top of the sack, an envelope, and on the envelope was written in a plain, steady hand, "To whoever opens this box." Ezra Bellamy sat down on the stool with the envelope in his hand for a long time before he opened it. When he opened it, he read it slowly, and then he read it a second time, and then he folded it back into thirds and slid it into the pocket of his chambray shirt, and closed his eyes and let his head rest against the cinder-block wall. The letter said in the voice of a man who has already made up his mind to die, "To whoever opens this box, my name is Silas Renfro. I did not take the money." Ferlin Hoy took the money on the night of the 19th of September, 1961, and I saw him take it because I had gone back to the cooperative that night to fetch the account book so I could work on it at home while I sat up with my wife. He did not see me. I watched him from the door, and I did not speak because I did not yet believe what my eyes were showing me. In the morning, I confronted him. He laughed at me. He told me that I had no witness and no proof, and that his brother was the sheriff and his cousin was on the board, and that if I spoke a word, he would see to it that I lost the farm before Odessa was in the ground. I made this ledger from the true books before he could alter them, and I have put it here with the money he will surely never miss, because he took $11,000 from the cooperative and another $14,000 from an account only he and I knew about, and that money is gone, and I cannot get it back. But this money and this ledger will speak for me when I can no longer speak for myself. I have welded this box shut with my own hands. I learned to weld in the Army. It is not fancy work, but it will hold. If you have opened this, then you are a man of patience, and a man of patience is the only kind of man I trust to do what should be done. Take these things to the sheriff of any county but this one, and to the newspaper in Nashville, and let the truth be told. My name is Silas Renfro. I did not take the money. Signed this 3rd day. The name on the ledger, the name initialed beside Silas Renfro's on every page, the name Ferlin Hoyt, was the name of Delbert Hoyt's father, who had died a wealthy man in 1970 and whose son had inherited a Chevrolet dealership and a house on the hill and the mustard yellow sport coat and the little finger ring with the green stone. Ezra Bellamy could have kept the money. He could have burned the ledger and the letter in the barrel out behind the shop and buried the canvas sack under the concrete of the new bay he was planning to pour that summer, and no one on earth would ever have known. $11,320 in 1979 was more money than Ezra Bellamy had ever held in his hand at one time in his life. It would have paid off his house and bought a new truck and left enough to sit in the bank drawing interest for the rest of his days. He thought about this. He thought about it for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he closed the crate and covered it with a tarp and went into the house and slept a sleep so deep and dreamless that when Corbin came by at 7 in the morning, he had to knock 3 times to wake him. The next day, which was the 22nd of March, 1979, Ezra Bellamy drove not to the sheriff of Ashcombe County, but to the sheriff of Meade County, 1 county over, whose name was Halloran and who had known Ezra since 1958 and who was known throughout the region as a man who could not be bought and could not be talked out of a thing once he had set his mind to it. Ezra Bellamy laid the ledger and the letter and the canvas sack on Sheriff Halloran's desk, and he said, "This belongs to the town of Ashcombe. It does not belong to me." And Sheriff Halloran read the letter, and then he read the ledger, and then he picked up his telephone and made 3 calls, and by that evening, the story broke on the front page on the 27th of March. It ran for 4 days. The Ashcombe Farmers Cooperative held an emergency meeting on the 29th and voted unanimously to restore Silas Renfro's name to the founder's plaque on the wall of the main office and to place Odessa Renfro's grave, which had lain unmarked beside her husband's for 17 years because none of the cousins would pay for a stone, received a stone in April, paid for by the cooperative and set by a stonemason who worked for free. And Delbert Hoy, who had walked into the Blue Star Diner on the morning of the 27th, expecting to tell one more joke about Bellamy's tin coffin, walked out of it an hour later without having ordered his coffee, and he was not seen in the diner again for the rest of that spring. The dealership limped along for 2 more years before it closed. Delbert Hoy sold the house on the hill and the blue Impala and moved to Florida in the summer of 1981, and nobody in Ashcombe spoke his name much after that, and nobody spoke his father's name at all. The welded crate itself, cleaned and set on a small oak stand, was placed in the front lobby of the Ashcombe Town Hall in June, with a card beside it that read, in typed letters under glass, "This crate was welded shut by Silas Renfro in October of 1962 to preserve the truth of his innocence." It was opened by Ezra Bellamy on the 21st of March 1979. The town of Ashcombe offers its apology to the memory of an honest man. Ezra Bellamy did not attend the ceremony. He was invited, and he sent his regrets in a note written in the same small, careful hand he had used to sign for the crate at the auction. But one evening in late June, when the town hall was closed and the streets of Ashcombe were empty and the light in the west was going the color of a peach that has sat too long on the sill, Ezra Bellamy drove his old Ford into town and parked across the street from the town hall, looking through the front glass of the lobby at the crate on its oak stand. He did not get out of the truck. He did not need to. After a while, he lifted one finger to the brim of his work cap, as though acknowledging somebody on the far side of the glass, and then he started the engine and drove home the long way past the cemetery where he had welded the gate 3 times, and past a second bridge on the county road where a man had gone into the water in the fall of 1962, and back to the shop behind his house where the light over the bench was still on because he had forgotten to turn it off before he left. So I will leave it with you. If you had been Ezra Bellamy that night, standing in a quiet shop with $11,000 in a canvas sack and a dead man's letter in your pocket, and no living soul to know the difference, would you have burned the letter and buried the money and gone on with your quiet life a richer man? And driven the truth 1 county over at 7 in the morning, and given a stranger back his good name 17 years too late?